want to welcome you to this training session brought to you by the Society of American Archivists, Archivists of Religious Collections section. My name is Joel Thorson, and we should first acknowledge that we live and work on the traditional lands of many Indigenous nations. We know that Indigenous people have suffered from historical and ongoing injustices and understand as archival organizations that we must work towards sharing historical truths and renew respectful relationships with Indigenous communities. We respect the longstanding relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land as the original caretakers. We are grateful for their stewardship and protection of the water and earth. We pay our respects to elders past and present. Today's topic is preserving film and outsourcing digitization. Before I introduce our presenter, we have a few items here on the disclaimer. The content in these presentations is for information only and is not legal advice. Our views do not represent the organizations where we work. We do not make any endorsements or guarantees. We are not liable for any loss or damage caused by your use of the content we provide. It is your responsibility to critically evaluate the content provided in the presentation or any accompanying materials. Now there's a few things here to understand about the presentation. You won't be able to use your microphone or video during the session. You can click on the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen, and under live transcript, click Enable Auto Transcription to get closed captioning. There will be a question period after the presentation concludes. You should use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. We will not answer questions in the chat or unmute attendees due to the time constraints. Now, please be respectful in your interactions. We expect you to follow the SAA Code of Conduct there on the SAA website. This session will be recorded and will be available on the YouTube channel afterwards. If you're watching it delayed, please remember to like and subscribe. And please fill out the short survey after the session ends. And of course, we encourage you to join the Society of American Archivists if you're not already a member. And we thank the Congregation of the Sisters of St. Joseph in Canada for hosting this webinar. Now, our speaker today is Christina Stewart, and Christina is a film and media archivist at Media Common Archives, University of Toronto Libraries, a graduate of the L. Jeffrey Selznick School of Film Preservation at George Eastman Museum. She has worked with collections at George Eastman Museum, Northeast Historic Film, Canadian Filmmakers Distribution Center, and the Canadian National Exhibition Archives. She has taught film preservation workshops through provincial archival associations across Canada. She is and also in graduate programs at the University of Toronto and Toronto Metropolitan University. In 2016, Christina discovered Secrets of the Night from 1924, a previously lost film directed by Herbert Blaché and released by Universal Studios. Christina.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this wonderful lunch and learn about preserving film and outsourcing digitization, which is a very hot topic these days. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll just get right into it. So being in Toronto, thank you. So being in Toronto, I also have a land acknowledgement. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So today's agenda is we're going to go through basics of film preservation and film identification. We're going to talk a little bit about how to prep your materials for digitization, if you have the capabilities to do that. Then understanding digitization services and a little bit about budgets, questions for vendors, and then if there should be time allowing, questions for me. So what is film preservation? It's more than conservation and digitization. It's a profession, it's a field of practice, it's a domain or area of interest in research. So as a profession, film archivists, film preservation has its own literature, body of knowledge, concepts and principles, paradigm, best practices, and professional associations. It plays a critical role in shaping cinema history and in the evolution of our understanding of media and culture. And this rests on the central belief that audiovisual documents are no less important, in some contexts more important than other kinds of documents and artifacts. This comes from Ray Edmondson from his 2016 UNESCO publication, Audiovisual Archiving, Philosophy and Principles, which is available for a free download on UNESCO's website. So just because something is audiovisual, a popular medium, that doesn't make it less culturally or historically significant. Some films are made for entertainment, but these can even tell a lot about the era and culture that produced them. At the same time, there are many films that are not made for entertainment and have direct social and political significance. Of course, there are also many shades in between these extremes. But critically, film preservation is not a subset of the larger field like archival science, library science, art conservation, and museology. But it's a distinct field in its own right. However, film preservation draws from these fields, and there are some clear similarities. The concern with originals, with published and unpublished versions, with context and artifacts, usually technology, but there is an artifactual basis for the films themselves. And like these fields, film preservationists are focused on balance of preservation and access. Preservation is a central concept in film preservation, and the field as a whole wrestles with how to balance between preservation and access. All of this is a very nice way of saying that film preservation is part of the broader area of cultural heritage. Now, here's another publication called the Film Preservation Guide. Some of you might have already heard about this publication from 2005. It's still relevant today. It's dated, it's aged very well, I should say. So it's the basics for archives, libraries, and museums. It's a free download. It's a PDF, filmpreservation.org, which is the National Film Preservation Foundation. So please go there. It's very practical. It walks you through more in-depth things that I'm going to talk about here. So let's get going. Never discard your film materials after digitization unless there is a severe biological issues present, so like mold or any sort of, I'll say, liquid damage due to biological issues as well. And never let a vendor keep your materials or talk you into discarding them. And this is because digital doesn't last forever. Your films are your master materials that you can keep going back year after year, decade after decade, as technology, film types, and platforms change. So for example, probably when I was at the George Eastman Museum, the most two preserved titles, film titles in the world are The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind. Every time there is a new technology brought in or a new file type or a new 8K 10K resolution technology available, out come the nitrate originals and they get fresh scans, because you can only go back so many generations to migrate and duplicate those digital assets. So please keep your materials for as long as possible, even if they are nitrate. So film is organic. It deteriorates over time. However, proper storage environments are key to its longevity and survival. Now, not all of us have state-of-the-art temperature and humidity controls, but the main thing here is cool and dry and consistent temperature and humidity levels. As long as it's consistent in a cool and dry environment, it will last decades, decades upon decades. It's when we get into trouble with temperature and humidity is when there's constant big fluctuations. The film is organic, so it expands and contracts with every single one of those changes. And so it really damages the materials. So speaking of damage, there's 3 types of material damage. There's physical, which is color fading, black and white oxidation, shrinkage, warpage, curling. Biological, which is mold, fungus, bugs, insects, rodent droppings, that sort of stuff. And then mechanical damage. This is damage that occurs when films that are exhibiting shrinkage or warping get put through a projector or any other mechanical piece of equipment and it tears or scratches, projector claw marks happen. And that's mechanical damage because that damage happens when it's going through a mechanical piece of equipment. Here's some images of, we all know what mold looks like. This is the image on the left is mold on some film. This can be cleaned to a certain extent, and you can still scan it after it's been cleaned. On the lower right is a film that has been warped and shrunk, particularly because it was stored in an environment that was temperatures were rapidly fluctuating, and the film end was not taped down. Films need to be taped and secured down in order to give it structure. Without that structure, the film is left to just kind of do its own thing and expand and contract with the temperature and humidity fluctuations. And that's the result of what's happened in the bottom image there. The top image, that's a little bit red. You can kind of see at the top there, these little scratch, black and white kind of marks through the top of the image. Those are projector claw marks. And so projectors have an advancement claw that goes through the perforations to advance the film through the projector or any other mechanical device to advance the film through. And when film is shrunk, those claws miss the perforations, and that's what happens when film jumps out of the gate, so to speak. That's the type of damage. Now here's a cross section of film. So we got our film base at the bottom. So that's acetate, nitrate, triacetate, diacetate. And then we have our photochemical emulsion at the top, which is what carries our content, which is our picture and our soundtrack. And then in between is what we call the binder, and it binds the two together. Now I mention this because as film archivists, media archivists, we constantly are struggling with content versus carrier. The carrier is the film base. It's carrying that content, which is in the emulsion. And these two have two different, sometimes two different ways, two different preservation tactics, depending on what's going on with the film. So we have to keep those in mind when we're deciding our digitization priorities and strategies. So for film identification, you need to know what type of film materials you have in order to have intellectual control over them. And also when you talk to vendors, you need to know which questions to ask based on your materials that you have. And also you need to know what services you're asking for and why you're asking for them. And sometimes that depends on what's your end product going to be. Why are you transferring these materials? Are you doing it for preservation? Are you doing it for access? Are you doing it for social media? You need to know going in why you're doing this. Also, it helps plan your budgets because of the different levels of service that you can have for your materials, and what questions and how to talk to vendors. It's very important that you remember that you're in control of your materials, and you need to get as much information from the vendor as possible. The four main things you need to know when it comes to your film is the film gauge, or the size of film that you have, 35 millimeters, 16, the 8 millimeters. What element type you have, which is color, black and white, negative, positive, if it has a soundtrack or not, and the total length in feet that you have. Now I'm going to break these down to help you be able to understand and identify what you have, because you need to know exactly what you have in order to get a proper quote from a vendor. So in this image, 35 millimeter is at the top, and this is the width of the film. Okay, you can use a ruler to measure it if you're not sure. 28 millimeter is in between 35 and 16. It's not noted on here, but it is it's a unique format that you may or may not have in your collections. 16 millimeter, super 16 millimeter, 9.5 again is a unique format, and it's very distinctive because its perforations are in between the film frames, as you can see here. And then you have your 8 millimeters. You've got regular 8 millimeter, which was the first 8 millimeter film on the market. And then you have super 8 millimeter, and that came onto the market in the early 1970s. So for 35 millimeter, you can have negative or positive film. It can be either color or black and white, sound or silent. Now, if you've got negative film, it's always going to be silent, because picture and sound are captured separately on the set during shooting. So your negative film will always be silent, and you will have a separate soundtrack type. It's either going to be magnetic or it's going to be an optical track where it just has the soundtrack on it. There'll be no picture, but there'll be a soundtrack on it. So it could be a positive print with a soundtrack, and it could be color or black and white. It's very similar to 16 millimeter. All of these element types for 35 and 16 are roughly the same. 28 millimeter will be positive only. It will be tinted color or black and white, and will always be silent. Super 16 is a negative format, color black and white, and it will always be silent. Regular 8 or standard 8, it can be called both things, will always be a positive, whether it's a print or a reversal print or a reversal stock. As long as it's a positive, you don't need to worry about if it's a print or if it's a reversal. If it's a positive image, that's fine. It can be either silent or sound. More than likely, it'll be silent. And then super 16, or sorry, super 8, you can have either negative or positive, color, black and white, silent or sound. I know that sounds like a lot of information, but if you break it down per gauge, meaning the size of the film, and then you break it down per type, and then with the soundtrack, like we were talking about earlier, it makes it a lot easier to organize, and then organize in your mind. So if you have more than one film to transfer, and they're different gauges, meaning 35, and you got some 35, you got some 16, or you got some 16 and some 8 millimeters. This is what I do for ease and to avoid confusion. going through the digitization process, I separate the films in groups per gauge. So I have all my 16ths together, and I've got all my regular 8s, and I'll have all my super 8s together. So I've got them all in gauge groups. And then from there, I break them down to element type. Is it color? Is it black and white? Silent or sound? Negative or positive? And I break down, so 16s, I might have 2 films. One's a negative, one's a positive. I'll separate those out. The negative is going to be silent. The print has sound. Now, if I have a negative, I need my negative soundtrack as well. And if I don't have it, then there's no need for me to digitize and spend the money on that 16mm negative. If I know that it's supposed to have a soundtrack, there's no need to spend the money on that, because you can use that money to potentially digitize something else that's complete. Similar with your 8mm, you break out your black and whites, your colors, and your silence and your sounds, even with Super 8. Break them down that way to avoid confusion. Excuse me. You can always, and I recommend it, ask for more than one quote from your vendor. Ask for a quote for your 35s, ask for a quote for your 16s, and so forth. Now, the reason why I break these down is because basically costs. It comes down to costs. Color film will be more expensive to transfer than black and white, because color film has a lot more information to process and render on the back end than black and white film. Similar with sound films. You have your picture that's captured, and then you've got your sound that's captured. So you'll have your image files, and you'll have your sound files that they're going to capture. Those are more expensive than silent films, because you don't have to pay for sound rendering or sound capturing. So if you're on a tight budget, it's a lot easier to be able to see exactly where your costs are as you go through the process. So if you need to cut out a negative because you don't have a soundtrack when you know it should have a soundtrack, you don't really need to scan that. Unless it's unique and it's the only element available of what you have, then by all means, go ahead. So here's some 35mm. Depeche Mode 101 is a print with a soundtrack. You have the squiggly lines on the right side, on the left side, I'm sorry. The black and white on the right side is a silent 28mm print. The orange image in the middle, that's color negative. Color negative will always look orange, and it'll be a negative image. 16mm, similar. Silent on the left-hand side, tinted silent. In the middle, we've got black and white with sound. And then on the opposite side, you see the same film, faded color with a soundtrack, and then color corrected on the opposite side. Now the 8mm, it's very important to understand 8mm, how to identify the difference between 8mm. And it's all down to the size of the perforations. So as you can see, the purple image on the right is 8mm, regular 8mm or standard 8mm. It has the same size perforations as 16mm. So when Super 8 came on the market in the early 1970s, what they basically did, because the width didn't change, so they had to add more picture frame. So what they did was they cut the perforations in half, literally cut them in half, to extend the picture frame just that much more, so you could get more image area. So, excuse me. So when you're identifying your 8 millimeters between regular 8 and super 8, just look at the perforations. Remember that 8 millimeter has the same perforation size as 16 millimeter, and you'll be good to go. Soundtracks. So you're looking at your film, you're trying to identify if it has a soundtrack or not. Back to the 16s with the orange, with the yellow tint on the left-hand side. You'll see there's no soundtrack. It's double perfed on the sides. There's no room for a soundtrack. When sound came in, they got rid of one side of perforations and added the soundtrack, as you can see in the middle black and white image there with a soundtrack on it. Similar with 35 millimeter. They kept both perforations and both sides of perforations, they just shortened the image frame. So you've got on the left side here, you've got two different types of soundtracks on this black and white, on this color image. You've got the kind of like barcode looking lines on the bottom of that crescent shape. And then on the top of the crescent shape, you've got their squiggly lines. Those are both area tracks. They're both optical tracks. Sorry, they're not area tracks. One's variable area, one's density on the bottom, but they're both optical tracks. And if you see that on your film, it's no problem to transfer whatsoever. The image in the middle with the color film is a little bit more unique. That has a magnetic soundtrack on it. So on the edge opposite the perforations, it kind of has this brown looking strip. That's a magnetic sound. And if you find that you have films that have magnetic sound, be sure to ask your vendor if they can transfer magnetic soundtracks. It's unique these days. Not very many vendors have magnetic sound readers for their scanners. So double check, because it might be an extra cost to have that transferred, because they might have to send that out themselves to transfer the sound for you and then marry it back with the image in the end. So just double check. But if you just have the optical tracks, that's totally fine. Easy peasy. Now, the last thing you need to know is how to gauge how long your film is. And by that, to total up how much footage you're sending to the vendor for a certain gauge. So the image on the left here with the film reels on it, these are just kind of rough. The times on here for the minutes noted are just kind of rough. So if you have a small 3-inch reel, that's roughly 50 feet. And then 100 feet, 4 inches is 100 feet. It goes up every inch. So just measure with a ruler the size of your film reel. If it's completely full of film, it's going to be a full 200 feet. If it's less, by like, say maybe half, say you've got a 5-inch reel that's totally loaded as this image shows, then you've got 200 feet of film. If it only shows about half the amount of film than what this image shows, then you probably maybe only have 100 feet of film. And it's okay to kind of have this as an estimate footage. And you can let the vendor know this is how it works. And so every vendor will understand this. On 400-foot reels, the 7-inch, the blue inch reel, sometimes those have measurement markings on the side of the reel, so you can tell a little bit more accurately if you don't have a fully loaded reel. You can actually kind of gauge where the film stops, and you can look at the measurement to see, okay, maybe it's 325 feet or something like that. And so when you have, say, 16 millimeter, say you've got two two 200 footers, so that's 400 feet. And then you've got another reel that's 400 feet, which is the 7-inch reel. So you've got 800 feet total. That's all, say, color silent film. Then you have to put that footage into time, because a lot of vendors, say 50% of the vendors, calculate their costs per minute versus per foot. So you need to be able to have both a footage number and a duration time number. So then you go to Scene Savers in their film footage counter. Kodak also has one on their website. In the film type, it's a drop down. So you select which which gauge you have, 16, 35, 8mm, it doesn't matter, whatever you have. Always choose 24 frames a second, because that is what the vendor is going to scan to and base their costs on, is 24 frames a second. And then all you need to do in the feet category, you put in your 800 feet and then you hit calculate, and it comes up and it tells you the time of duration, gives you an hour and a minute. You don't need to worry about the seconds, but you need that duration time to give to the vendor so they can calculate how much it's going to be for you to just scan those. So with that, you've got your gauge, your film type, soundtrack or not, and your footage, your duration. Those are the 4 main things you need to ask a vendor for a quote. The next, how you can kind of figure out what all of those are, is either if you have a film bench like on the right, then you can just wind it out and look yourself. But if you don't have a film bench, you can still just wind out flat on either a light table or a table that you've got like a light box or a light table, or you can even just shine the light through on your phone so you can see the image frame clearer than just without any light. So what you can do here is, once you wind it out past the white leader, the protective leader on the edge, you just need to go in a little bit of the film to tell what you have. You can tell if it's color, if it's black and white. You can tell if it has a soundtrack. You can tell if it's negative or positive, and you can figure out if it has a soundtrack or not, and you're good to go. And then you measure your film. If your film is on a core, like what's here, then you can measure it with a film stick, film measuring gauge. One side has black and white, one side has color, and then on either side, one is for a 2-inch core or one is for a 3-inch core. 3-inch cores are the archival standard to measure your film. Now we get into the nitty-gritty here. Digitization services. So to some of you, this is a lot of information, and I'm just going to pull it up here to show you the different types of options of one vendor that we have here in town that we use a lot and we recommend to other archival institutions because they do great work, amazing work. And they understand how archival materials are, they know how to work with archival materials, and they understand the significance of them, which is why we trust them and we use them. So, best practices. So we're going to come back to this at the end. So I know it looks 4K versus 2K versus economy scan, flat versus timed, 4:3 versus 16:9, mask, no mask, overcrop scan. We're going to come back to this because we're going to talk through it. Best practice is for 35mm, you do a 4K scan because the image can take it. Now I think we're up to 8 to 10K scans. For archival reasons, the human eye can't see anything past 6K. So in anything past 6K, we're going into industry type stuff with IMAX, with super high def. We're not in the industry. We're not doing industry scans of feature films primarily. 4K is good. 4K is the best. It's the archival standard. 16 in the 2 8mm, a 2K scan. A lot of vendors will say, nope, everything needs to be 4K and higher. It's entirely up to you if you want to go 4K for 16 or the 8mm. Personally, I would not. 8mm frames are really small. 2K far exceeds getting as much detail as it allows without it becoming any bit of distortion, adding distortion, which we don't want to do. So raw capture scan for a picture is either a DPX or ProRes. There used to be JPEG 2000, but that's kind of gone by the wayside these days. And then sound, because we do capture them sound and pictures separately, an uncompressed WAV file. So all those files are uncompressed. Digital intermediates, access files for picture, H.264, MOV files or MP4s, and for sound, MP3s. And then composite access files, that's where we bring our picture and sound together to marry the two to make a composite file. And those are access files, something that you can put up on your websites and social media. Those are also MP4s or MOVs or H.264 files. Now, raw scans are uncompressed capture. They're your master file. These are ones you don't manipulate. You're scanning the film as it is in front of you. There's no manipulation. That's your raw, uncompressed scan. From those scans, and the files are massive. You're not going to do any sort of editing or color corrections on those scans. What you're going to do is you're going to create digital intermediates or your access files from those scans. Those are compressed. They're a lot easier to work with. From there, you can manipulate color, density, or any sign of sound correction. So if it's a color faded, it's magenta, and you have a little bit of color left that you're able to extract and bring out, do it with your digital intermediates or your access files. Access files are compressed composites, as I mentioned before. You can watch them, you can upload them. They're easy to work with. You can edit them. They're much easier. And then your composite files, as I mentioned, are your married picture and sound, your finals. Now we're coming into color corrections or your type of scans. You either have a flat scan, which is sometimes called a one light scan. There's no color correction. There's no density corrections. It's scanned using a one light. And then you have your timed scans. Now this is for your digital intermediates after your raw capture, which is the best archival practice. Then you have your time scans, which means each scene is color corrected for color, or for black and whites, the density is timed by a colorist. They sit and look at every single scene and adjust the densities or the colors to bring out what's there. So if it's too light, if it's too dark, they'll even it out so you can actually see what's going on if that information is there. And then you have supervised scans. This is similar to a time scan, but you actually get to sit with the colorist and then you collaborate on timing. So with Secrets of the Night, that's what I did. I had a silent 16mm Kodascope print that was tinted. So because tinted prints aren't something that colorists particularly are used to working with, and I sat with the colorist because I knew how those colors are supposed to look projected. How the ambers are supposed to look, how the pinks are supposed to look, how the lavenders are supposed to look, and how the blue night scenes are supposed to look. So I sat down with them and then we graded or timed each scene according to how it would have been perceived at the time, rather than our modern eyes putting something inauthentic on the screen. Now we have overscanning, basically overscans, which is the lady on the right here. We always scan edge to edge because we want, this is for our raw scan, we scan edge to edge, which again is best practice because you can see all of the information, the manufacturer's information, soundtrack information, and the perforation information on those scans. Sometimes our researchers want that because they're researching soundtrack types or they're researching stock manufacturers and how they look, how they framed. But then when you come to your digitization services, they're going to ask you for, and this is getting into aspect ratios, do you have a 4:3 display? Do you have a 16:9? And again, this is something you need to think about when you're talking and when you're thinking about your end product. Do you want it letterboxed or is it going to be pillar boxed? Because modern televisions and modern screen monitors these days are not the standard 4:3 that the image on the right was captured for. She's a 4:3. She should be cropped as a 4:3 for the access files. And you have options here, and it's something that you can talk to the vendor about. Okay. I've come back to this one now. So now that you know your 4K, your 2K, or your economy scan, which is you just need to know what's on it. It's a low contrast, it's a flat scan, it's cropped to the image. You just need to know what's on it. It's the most inexpensive scan out there, but you're not going to do, you're just going to scan it and get an access file. You're not going to get your raw capture scan. You're not going to get any of the other things. It's just to see what's on it. And that's totally fine because it still is providing access to content that was inaccessible before. So if we come back to this and we're looking at your 4K premiums, which is for best practice is 35mm, you have your timed color in contrast, which means contrast equals black and white. You have your 16:9 no mask, max to 4:3, which we just talked about, overscan, edge to edge. And it explains, you know, shows this the perforations or cropped. That's for timed. And then you have your 4K with flat, which is your one lights. There's no color corrections whatsoever. 16:9 or 4:3. There you go. And then your 2Ks, which you'll look out for your 16mm or your 8mm. And it's the same options for flat or timed. And you can choose from there how you want, what you need or what you think is the best thing to have for your project. There's really no tried and true. It's based on what your end goal for the material is. So us at Media Commons, if we have a 35mm, we automatically know it's going to be a 4K. And depending on if it needs any, if there's, just sorry about that. We know it's going to be 4K if it's 35mm. And then we look at the color, if it's a color film, to see if it's faded at all. Even, is it faded? If it's the color's great across the board on that reel of film, then we don't need it timed. We can do a flat. And it'll save us a ton of money because every single little thing is going to cost you money. So one of the slides I should have put in here, which I didn't, which is all of the separate little fees. So you're either going to be charged for your scanning, which is either per minute or per foot, depending on the vendor. So that's your flat rate. And then you've got rendering fees. I'll just get into the questions because I kind of explain it here. So questions for your vendor is, do you provide a quote before I send the materials? Meaning you have an online quote, you just fill in the questions, you get a quote the next day or later that day. If the vendor does not provide a quote, I would find another vendor. Simple as that. You need a quote because your budget is based on your quotes. Now, this next question is very important. Do you have a tension or a sprocket-driven scanner? You don't need to ask what make or model. They're probably not going to tell you, but you do need to know if it's tension or sprocket-driven. If you've got, if it's tension-driven, then you don't need to worry about shrinkage. If it's sprocket-driven, which means there's a claw that comes through and advances the film through the scanner, then you might, take a look to make sure that your materials are in really good shape before you send it to a vendor that has a sprocket-driven scanner. Do you inspect and clean my films before scanning? Yes. Is there a fee for that? Because there will be sometimes a cleaning fee. Do you have a setup fee? Meaning, will they add leader? They'll have to add leader if you don't have enough leader on your films at the very beginning and at the end. And is there a fee for that? Usually there's not, but sometimes you just want to check so you're not surprised on your quote. Can I download my digital files after scanning? Some vendors don't offer a download service. It's free. It should be free. They shouldn't charge you for this. They'll just Dropbox it. Or do you offer physical media options for my scans? Meaning, will they burn you a DVD or possibly a Blu-ray? But there will be there'll be costs for that. So if you can send the vendor, when you send your films, send the vendor an external hard drive. They'll put all your files on that external hard drive and send it back with your films when they're done. There will be a rendering fee. Usually it's capped at like $20 or $50. And there'll sometimes be a cleaning fee, but you have to ask. Setup fee, usually not, but again, you have to ask. And a processing fee. Everybody has, because they have to pay for the rendering at the back end. There's all these little hidden fees and you need to ask. If you have any questions, remember, this is your material. You still have control over it. If there's anything that you feel the vendor is not answering, or you just kind of have a gut feeling, then find another vendor. There's plenty of them out there. You can also ask around your archival institution or organizations to see who has a good reputation, who's used whose. Is there anybody you recommend versus not recommending? That sort of thing. And that is the end. So we have 10 minutes left if anybody has any questions for me. And thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have some questions.
Should I stop sharing?
No, actually, someone's asking about the film, measuring the film reels again.
Oh, shall we go back?
Yeah, if we could go back, they would like to, could you go over that a little bit more about
that slide?
One more time for vendor quotes, calculating length, time, how much of the film is used versus blank.
Versus blank. I'm not sure I understand versus the blank part. But...
all the films I've encountered in archives, they really didn't leave a lot of blank footage on.
You mean the leader?
I think they just meant part of the film that wasn't exposed, but I don't think that usually is present. But maybe the leader. Maybe.
So to get back to the blank bit, just in case I'm misunderstanding, but the white image on the bottom is white, so it's blank. It's usually protective leader, and you usually would have if you've got the small rolls processed by Kodak, the 8mm or the 16mm, Kodak would have put white leader that says processed by Kodak around, spliced onto the film. with a little rubber band around it. And then sometimes with 16 millimeter, you'll also have a leader that's identified. You have your identification on it. And then it goes into a lab leader, which is kind of sometimes blank before you get into the image. That's totally fine. They're only going to charge you for the beginning of the first frame of image. They shouldn't charge you for the leader or blank film. Now, to go back to measuring, this is the tricky bit, and I do apologize for this. I tried to make it simple. So, can you repeat the question again, just so I understand where I'm going with this?
Well, she says, can you walk through measuring the film one more time for vendor quotes, calculating length, time, how much of the film is used?
Right. So, the reel's on the right-hand side. If you're measure your film with a ruler, which I don't seem to have, or a measuring tape, which I don't seem to have in front of me. Oh, actually, I do. So measure it. Measure the width of your reel, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 inches. Those will tell you how large that reel is with how many feet of film it can handle maxed out. The total amount of film that can be put on that reel. So if we're looking at the 5-inch reel, that's 200 feet of film. If it's fully loaded, you can assume you've got 200 feet of film. If it's half loaded of film, just assume you've got 100 feet. 3/4, 70, 175 feet of film. Then you take your total footage that you think you have in a certain gauge, and then you go to the film footage calculator, either here at Scene Savers, or at Kodak.com also has a film footage counter. You select your film type. It's a drop down. It'll have all the different types of film sizes, which is 35 millimeter 16, your 8 millimeters. There'll be like 28 millimeter 9.5. It'll show literally a whole range of different film sizes. Keep the speed at 24 frames a second, because that's what sound film is set at. And that's what vendors will quote you at, 24 frames a second. Put in the total number, your total feet number, your total footage number for that gauge, and then hit calculate. And the calculator will come back and tell you the time. So 16 millimeter 24 at 200 feet. I have a cheat sheet on my wall here. 200 feet is roughly 6 minutes. Total up all of your time, and then you tell that to the vendor and they calculate the costs for you. I hope that answers your question.
Well, we have a couple of related questions about the cores. Should we be replacing them on archival cores? And is there a standard size, or and how does that affect the measurements?
Right. So the measurements will be, so standard size for cores is 3 inches, just because it's larger and it allows the film to relax more from when it's tight on a small hub on a film reel. If your film is constantly being projected and it's a working archive, then leave it on a reel because it has to be projected on a reel. It's just easier for the film. But if it's not getting accessed as part of your long-term archival storage, putting it on a core is best, especially if you don't have proper humidity and temperature controls. Because film, as I mentioned before, is organic, it expands and contracts. So as it does that, the film doesn't lay back flat when it expands and contracts. It kind of leaves little ridges up. And if it's on a reel, those ridges will hit up against the arms flanges on the reel. And sometimes over time, it'll start to curl the film in on its edges. So it's best to do it on a core if possible.
And could you talk a little bit about vinegar syndrome and what's the best way to deal with it? Are you freezing or in sealed cans, segregating in vented cans, digitizing and deaccessioning?
So vinegar syndrome is it's it's a scourge. How we do it is so vinegar syndrome doesn't, you can still digitize the films. You can still measure the level of acidic off-gassing with AD strips that you can get through the Image Permanence Institute. And you can gauge the level of vinegar syndrome that you have. If you've got severe vinegar syndrome going, then it is best to digitize that content as quickly as possible. And depending on your institutional policies, if you want to deaccession it at that point, you can, because it's only going to get worse, especially if you don't have cool or cold storage to put it into to kind of deaccelerate those chemical reactions and catalytic points that send vinegar syndrome into the next level. Then that's a conversation you need to have. We segregate those, but we have cold storage, so we're able to keep our storage is between 5 and 9 degrees Celsius. So it slows down those chemical reactions to where it kind of negates the off-gassing.
Let's see. We've got a question. Let's see. This person doesn't have a setup to transfer the reels to new cores themselves. Can you ask the vendor to do that?
You can, very much so.
Okay.
They might charge you for it, but you can totally ask them to do it. If you even have your film leadered, but just wound in because you don't have splicing capabilities, you can always leader your film up and just wind it in like this and leave it like that and ask the vendor to splice it for you, and they'll totally do it, usually without a charge, but sometimes they'll charge. You just have to ask.
And if you do transfer to cores, can you do it by hand or do you need a machine or anything
Do it by
special?
hand with the film winder, manual. That's how we do it here.
That's how I always did it too.
Yes.
Let's see. Do you have any advice for someone who would like to get more practical experience with film preservation?
That's a good question. Depending on where you're based, you can reach out to any organizations that you know have film handling equipment and see if you can intern or volunteer to get that experience.
It looks like Mary Grace says we have to end the session right now. So thank you
Oh,
very much.
okay.
And thank you all of you
Sorry
for
for the,
attending.
thank you,
Check out
everyone.
our next session and which is coming up on, there's more film preservation topics. Check the SAA-ARCS mini site. Just Google that and you should be able to find it. But thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christina.